Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile. With the price of just about everything going up during inflation, we thought we'd bring our prices down. So to help us, we brought in a reverse auctioneer, which is apparently a thing.
Mint Mobile Unlimited Premium Wireless. How to get 30, 30, bit to get 30, bit to get 20, 20, 20, bit to get 20, 20, bit to get 15, 15, 15, 15, just $15 a month? Sold!
Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
$45 up front for 3 months plus taxes and fees. Promo rate for new customers for limited time. Unlimited more than 40 gigabytes per month. Slows full terms at mintmobile.com.
I'm Jason Pack.
And I'm David Patrikarakos.
And this is Disorder, a podcast where we try to forge a semblance of order out of our mad, and sometimes bad, but hopefully not too revengeful world. This week, we are giving you a special bonus episode about the recent attacks in the Middle East. And as anyone, even people who live under rocks and have never heard of social media know, in the early morning hours of April 14th, Iranian drones and missiles, about 300 of them, rained down on Israel. This attack was fairly well choreographed and telegraphed in advance, and its stated justification for the attack was a retaliation against Israel for its attack on the Iranian diplomatic compound in Damascus on April 1st. Nearly 99% of the projectiles were intercepted. I am really fortunate to be joined from the Middle East by our roving correspondent, David Patrikarakos. David, welcome.
Thanks, Jason. How are you? Doesn't let up, does it?
Yeah. Obviously I feel very safe and fortunate and well. It was a stressful night for everyone in the region, for Palestinians in Gaza, for Israelis, and no doubt for many Iranian and IRGC leaders who must be quite scared to leave their homes. No?
Well, you'd think so, yes. It is a very fraught time. A norm has been broken. Precedent has been set. A direct Iranian strike on Israeli sovereign territory. That is history.
Yeah. I think the key thing to highlight to our listeners, and you've done a lot of your career on this topic, is that for 4 or 5 decades, there's been a proxy war between Iran and Israel, but neither side has broken the taboo of having a direct attack on the other. Does the fact that this attack was so telegraphed that literally the Iranians told the Americans that they were going to do the attack, does that change the extent to which the precedent is broken? Or once the precedent is broken, it's broken?
Once the precedent is broken, it's broken. Obviously, as you correctly say, this was choreographed and telegraphed. So it was about sending a message as opposed to achieving a maximum amount of destruction. But the fact is, that precedent is broken. And above anything else, I think that is the overarching message here.
Okay. I agree with you on that. I'm going to say, though, the overarching message is something, to my mind, potentially more positive, which is that the international community, the US, the UK, Israel, Sunni Arab states like Jordan and Saudi Arabia, possibly even Iraq and other Gulf states, work together to allow their airspace, their intelligence assets to work together to neutralize these missiles. And that what I spoke about 6 or 7 months ago is the possibility that this horrific loss of life on October 7th and even more pointless and tragic loss of life since could be used to make a regional coalition to isolate the disorderers. I don't think it's going to happen, but I'm saying it could happen. Did we see a foretaste that could happen last night, David?
Well, that's really, really important, right? And this is actually what I've been writing about today. So when I talk about the message, that's the message the Iranian was sending. What you're talking about is the response. And this is really interesting to me because after October 7th, Israel briefly had sympathy from the world, unusual sympathy, unusual understanding. That, of course, changed as Israel responded as it was legally entitled and morally obliged to do. And obviously, as the war rolled on, you saw the images from Gaza, it was very distressing. Now, Iran saw this as not just an opportunity to commit more violence, but a political opportunity to lessen its isolation. Apart from anything else, this was the most politically opportune time for it to strike Israel. Israel is seen as a warmonger, an aggressor across the Arab world. Even in states that have come to normalization with Israel, the populations were very angry. I think that for the moment, with the caveat that things may change, especially in the Middle East, Iran committed a strategic error. Now, look at the papers this morning. Gaza is not leading it. The Iranian strike on Israel is leading it. There is less talk of sanctions on Israel. How can you deny military technology to a state that's just been attacked by the world's foremost sponsor of terror? Indeed, Israel can now say it is even more imperative that it finishes Iran's proxy Hamas in Gaza. And as you say, what is really interesting to me, what you saw was Iran on the one side, Israel, the United States, which, by the way, has been increasingly frustrated with Netanyahu, and the Arab states, which is to say Iran against the pre-7th of October status quo. I think this is a strategic error on Iran's part.
I hope so. And it's for Netanyahu to kick the ball into the open goal by not retaliating and coalescing those status quo diplomatic arrangements, or potentially to be swayed by the nutcases in his cabinet like Smotrich and Ben-Gvir and do some ill-thought-out retaliation. I was listening to the Israeli radio Galgalatz earlier today just to get a sense of the mood. And, they were talking about traffic jams and life being regular. And then, obviously, this was a joke, but they're like, for all the Israeli Air Force guys out there, we want to let you know that it's partially cloudy over Tehran and temperatures in Natanz are at 27 degrees centigrade, and we're expecting some cloud cover later today. And I get that it's a joke and it's like an interesting play of Jewish humor, but it's kind of not that funny when at this moment the political cover has been given to the hard right in Israel to make an attack that they otherwise would have had tremendous retribution for doing. But it doesn't make it right. It's still potentially a mistake because there's a huge opportunity here to circle the wagons with the Sunni Arab allies to create what I call the axis of the orderers against Iran, its proxies, and Russia. How do you see that this might play out?
Look, I agree with you 100%. And the onus is now back on Israel. Now, if you look at the rhetoric coming out, so far it seems measured. Benny Gantz said it will exact a price when the time is right. The rhetoric around all this is very interesting. I'm sure you know, Jason, that hours after the missiles were launched, Iran tweeted a statement saying the matter is concluded. But you're right. And this kicking a ball into the open goal is a very good analogy. We can only hope that they seize this opportunity when, albeit temporarily, there is some kind of sense of right back on Israel's side, and use it, and actually put this very well, to circle the wagons. Let's try and get that pre-October 7th status quo and not try and do something completely insane, which will alienate everyone. Again, let's go back to rhetoric. In February, Joe Biden was reported as saying Netanyahu is an effing bad guy. 2 days ago, he was saying the United States remains steadfastly committed to Israel's security.
Ironclad support.
So let's have more of that. Let's take this opportunity and bear in mind that, no Israelis have died. There was very little damage, and do something intelligent with it. And the Israelis are intelligent, but unfortunately they can also be a bit mad. So let's hope the former wins out over the latter. We are, Jason, in 100% agreement. That also, by the way, as well as the strike, is historic.
Yes. I actually want to relitigate with you some of our contentions from the very first pod that we did on October 10 that came out on October 12, right after the attacks. And you wrote a really interesting article in Unheard a few days ago that we're going to put in the show notes. And I'm going to quote you because I think this is very prescient, David. You wrote, amid the continuing destruction in Gaza and the surrounding global fallout, one thing becomes ever clearer. Even as Israel's war stutters, Iran's border campaign against it, and by extension, what we might call the American-led order, is growing in strength. 6 months on from October 7th, it's hard to see how Israel can achieve its stated goals of dismantling Hamas and rescuing its remaining hostages. So this really harkens back to our first bonus pod that was released on October 12th, where I said, you know what? Hamas has won and Israel has lost the war militarily from the get-go, from day two. And I stand by that. Israel can make a political victory, not just by playing the victim in a negative way, but by showing restraint. And I'll use this analogy to build on this, and then I want to hear you see if you still agree with what you said then or if you've changed your analysis. Let's say someone insults your girlfriend at a bar, and you say, hey, that was inappropriate. But you say it in a really gentlemanly and polite way. You don't say, you're a bad motherfucker. You just said, that was a really inappropriate and impolite comment. And he just tries to drunkenly punch you. And you block the punch because he's drunk and, he slips on the floor. It would seem to me that you have the moral high ground with everyone looking there and saying, I hope you could sober up, buddy. I forgive you. Why don't you sleep this off? You could, however, also kick him when he's down because he was the lunatic who just tried to punch you for no reason. I think that to regain the moral high ground at this moment could snatch political victory out of the jaws of defeat for Israel, but it won't snatch military victory because they've already lost. They can't defeat Hamas in Gaza, and they can't really, as it were, figure out a way to govern post-war Gaza. How do you see it?
Well, I think we're getting confused between political and military victories. So let's just put it this way. Let's rephrase it as battlefield victory. Israel cannot defeat Hamas and wipe it out totally. It's an unrealistic goal. But it does defeat Hamas on the battlefield. So maybe that's easier. And look, I was in Israel in February, and there were no Hamas rockets coming into Israel. When I was there in October, they were coming in all the time. So they have degraded Hamas's capabilities. I think we got stuck on the terminology here. Let's say battlefield victory. Hamas does not defeat Israel on the battlefield. It loses on the battlefield. Israel cannot militarily achieve its objectives, all of its objectives. In that sense, Israel loses the war, as I always said. Like, for example, the more that it succeeds, the more it loses, right? This is what I wrote in my last book, and this is what we say. And that's the point. Even if on the battlefield, you always vanquish Hamas, even if you don't destroy it, you still lose politically. It doesn't matter that you kill more of them. It doesn't matter that you destroy a lot of their tunnels. You still lose. But Hamas does still not defeat Israel on the battlefield face to face, but it does win the war, right? That's the key to all this.
Yeah, it's true. It isn't worth for us to quibble over terms, but just to clarify my view, I see Hamas winning on the battlefield and in the political war where they've goaded the overreaction. They've made Israel fall into the 9/11 trap. Sure. Iran has again proposed a kind of 9/11 trap with a much more incompetent attack, or a telegraphed one, than the Hamas attack. Obviously, you can't compare them, but it's for Israel now to exercise restraint. So I want to delve a little deeper into what might happen if the Israelis do not exercise restraint. Let's pretend we were in a situation where, given Israel's complex coalition politics, Bezalel Smotrich, the far-right Israeli leader of the National Religious Party, who's been finance minister since 2022, was instead defense minister. He said, great, we are going to use this to have a historic opportunity to settle grievances and to, show power and deterrence, like stuff that he and his supporters are already saying. What might that entail, and what could that lead to? Could he use it to precipitate the war of Gog and Magog?
Well, that's a depressing thought. Look, this is kind of speculation. Look, what can happen? It could be potentially limitless. If Israel responds en masse, the Iranians will respond themselves and via all their proxies. The Americans would be furious because the one thing they do not want consistently, as they've told me repeatedly when I'm in DC, and I'm sure you too, is they do not want a broader regional war with Iran. All bets are off, is what I can say. And then we really get into the sort of nitty-gritty of war. The point about Iran's strike is that it was actually a political message more than a military strike in and of itself. That was the point of it. Israel responds with an all-out military attack. Then Iran will respond. And this is where you have, it is a cliche, the 1914 analogy. Something happens, someone responds. No one wants it, but then it happens. And if this happens, because Israel does something that actually is not needed right now, then I think it will be very bad for Israel.
Yes. And I like the 1914 analogy because it's a series of miscalculations. The Iranians could easily think, hey, we're being so measured. We telegraphed the attack. Then when we did it, we said, our revenge is now concluded. We signaled to the Americans, they have every right to feel like, look, we've been mature.
And you know what? They would be right. And that's the thing. You're right. They would be correct.
And then if the Smotriches and Ben-Gvirs went out, it would really inflame them to say, look, we can't even deal with diplomacy with these people. We have to, showcase our force. I want to bring up the religious part, though, and obviously I'm just joking or teasing about the war of Gog and Magog. And for those who don't know, the wars of Gog and Magog are actually Jewish, Christian, and Islamic end of days prophecies. So Gog and Magog are mentioned in Ezekiel in the Hebrew Bible, but then they also come up again in the New Testament in the book of Revelation. And in the Quran, they are rendered as Yajuj and Majuj. And so there is a shared Judeo-Christian Islamic prediction here that certain events in the Middle East will lead to a kind of war of all against all, and that this apocalyptic war will see the allies of Satan pitted against the allies of God, and that it will have a nation struggle rather than a struggle of individuals. So you need to keep in mind that there are forces not only in the Islamic Republic of Iran and not only among Sunni jihadis, but among hard-right Jewish settlers who would like to see a war of all against all, and that this has to have a distinctly national component. In fact, the evangelical Christians who in the United States support Israel unwaveringly believe that Israel will precipitate these wars of Gog and Magog, and that it is at this moment that the second coming of Christ will come to absolve people. And to 99% of our listeners, I'm sure that this sounds ridiculous, and how could these kind of prophecies guide policy? But some people who are close to levers of power, or who lobby people close to levels of power, do want a theological war of all against all.
Yeah, sure. I mean, we have two fringes of religious fundamentalists, and in a sense, the dialectic is very clear here, and they want each other, these guys, and they deserve each other. But we have to hope that cooler heads prevail. There is a tension in Israel that I'm sure you know about between the IDF and many of the politicians. For example, the settlers. The IDF have repeatedly told me they know the settlers are a strategic threat to the state of Israel.
Correct.
They don't like having to protect them in the West Bank. As I say, this is all in the realms of speculation, but when you say to me that you have fanatics on one side and fanatics on another that perhaps on some level do want some form of holy war, I don't disagree. But it would be a total disaster. You have to pray. Let me put it a different way. If Israel allows this to happen, then as a state, as it currently exists, it's finished. It's no longer secular, reasonable, high-tech Israel.
It's existential for Israel if they mishandle this. 100% agree.
This is not 1966. It's not 1965. It's not 1948 or 49. Israel is not going to be thrown into the sea by its enemies. They can pose its serious risks, but it's not going to be militarily defeated. What it can do is fall from within. Israel, I do not believe, is going to be destroyed by Hamas or Hezbollah or the Houthis or Iran or a combination of them. But it can become a theocratic shithole. And that's essentially what everyone wants to avoid.
Yes, and the point here is the classical disorderer-orderer conundrum. If disorderers rule the roost, in other words, the people who want a completely disproportionate response, well, they're just going to disorder their own bed as well. It's not just going to harm the enemy. And it could even in this case lead to the collapse of the secular, rationalistic startup nation Israel that we've come to know and expect, and that this would then be a really horrific turning point where Israel would be turned into a Middle Eastern state with the dominance of a kind of out-of-touch ruling elite.
Why do people want to make peace with Israel, Jason? Why did the normalization accords happen? It's because the countries in this region, like the UAE, like Bahrain, like eventually maybe Saudi, want that Israeli tech. They want its know-how. They want its weaponry. They don't want to deal with a theocratic nutjob state. They've got enough of them already.
Well put. And not only that, they felt, as a result of decisions made by Rabin, Perez, to some extent, financial decisions made by Netanyahu in his earlier years, these are people that we can learn from and we can rely on. They're good at, making the desert bloom, and they understand certain things about the region, and they may even understand about the role of family and continuity and things that we value as well. But the Emiratis are classic in their repressing of any kind of theological thinking. The only theology they have is to defeat the Muslim Brotherhood. There's no other theological thinking in Emirati strategy. So it wouldn't just be that Israel would be acting against its own interests, it would be acting against its alliance system that it's been trying to build if it incorrectly responds now.
Israel needs to act with restraint and to seize the advantage that it has been given by Iran. Well, I'm going to go back to your analogy. Let's just gently kick the ball into the open goal and not pick it up and boot it into the crowd.
Yep, and I want to now pivot this to orderers and disorderers and the role of the West in diplomacy here. Although I talk a lot about ordering and disordering on this pod, I don't think that that's the only thing going on. I don't think it's the only way of looking at international relations. And of course, it simplifies where there's complexity. But with any heuristic, it might be a useful way of thinking about things in addition to others. So follow me on this train of thought here. There's an opportunity amidst all this crisis and calamity to try to get some orderers together for a saner, more ordered policy. And I hope that Biden and Sunak and some maybe non-aligned leaders like Modi and South Africa and Argentina can point out to the Israelis, there's this horrible famine going on in Gaza. It cannot continue. It's to no one's interest. It's unjust. It's immoral. Now is the time to renew diplomacy with these neighbors who've shown that they're your allies. Qatar, Egypt, Jordan, they showed that they didn't stand with Iran. Let's all work together to compromise. How do you think those next steps could work?
Okay, well, Israel has long-standing peace deals, albeit cold ones, with Jordan and with Egypt. So those relationships are there, they're cold ones, and Israel just needs to refocus on them. Actually, Sisi, funnily enough, and Netanyahu don't get on too badly because I think they're very similar in many ways. Look, I think the key here is Qatar. Now, Qatar is obviously problematic for a lot of reasons. It's closeness to Iran, it's housing of senior Hamas figures, by the way, who are worth billions and living in hotels while the people in Gaza are suffering. I think that I'm not against the idea of Israel trying to come to some sort of détente with Qatar.
And I'm a massive proponent for it, and I believe
look, I agree with you. Look, the Israelis are furious. When I go to Israel, they're furious because Qatar funds Hamas and so on and so forth, fine. But at the same time, it is through Hamas that you get some of the hostages out. Now, Israelis will tell you, well, if they didn't have all the money, the Qatari money to build the tunnels in the first place, things might have been easier. Fine, whatever. But we are where we are, and I think it's worth them trying to do it. The problem is politically right now in Israel, it's politically unacceptable. If the government started trying to do it, I think there would be a lot of problems from the population. And in the end, the government does, or in a democratic state anyway, the government does have to be wary of public opinion. So I think the time is probably not opportune right now, but it's something that it has to do. Look, you always have to talk to the people around you. Even when you're at war with people, you have back channels.
That's a very good point. And I think that the Iranians have shown that they're actually willing to have these back channels. They talked to the Americans before the attack. Why do you think, David, that the Israelis didn't alert the Biden administration of their planned attack on the Iranian generals in Damascus? Was that very, very uncouth of them, or did they just need to act so quickly? What are your views?
I think it was uncouth. There's huge tensions between Netanyahu and Biden. They clearly don't like each other. I think Netanyahu got on very well with Trump. Obama despised him as well. I think it's another example of crass diplomatic maneuvering by Israel, and it's regrettable. It is regrettable, and eventually it will come at a cost because Israel does need the United States, and you shouldn't offend the people by doing things like this. You know what it is? It's just petty.
Do you think that the Mossad or the Israeli high command would have felt, oh, the Americans are going to tell us not to do it, so they would rather ask for forgiveness after and just do it? Or just they simply don't value the relationship enough? They value their quote-unquote strategic independence or whatever, that they just did whatever they wanted?
Look, I can't say what's in their mind, but I think it's a variety of reasons. Israel acts anyway. I don't think anyone's really stopped Israel from doing a lot of its targeted assassinations. There might be a lot that we don't know about, but generally if Israel feels that it needs to act, it will act. And there's lots of things going on here. With Netanyahu, we're dealing with a man who just wants to stay in power. I mean, a lot of people say he just wants to stay out of jail, but the truth is he can stay out of jail. He can come to a deal. And that would be it. He wouldn't go to jail, but he'd have to leave power. So he doesn't want to leave power. He wants to show that he's tough. And bear in mind, this is a man who, whatever he says, presided over October 7th. The buck stops with him, to paraphrase Harry Truman. So maybe he's trying to be tough. Maybe he's trying to show his independence. Maybe he's trying to appease his fanatical right. A lot of this comes from that. Who knows? But in the end, it was uncouth. It was petty. And the Americans remember stuff like this, as you know more than me.
Great. So I think it's inappropriate these days to have a discussion of the geostrategy of this topic without delving a little bit more into the humanitarian suffering in Gaza. And you and I have talked about our experiences there, how densely packed it was, you know, the use of donkey and horse carts, the rather dire conditions even before the war. But, you know, there are reports that 50% of the population is living in a state of famine, and that young babies and pregnant mothers are going to experience the kind of cognitive decline that happens when you are malnourished for many months on end. So what's going on there with all of the aid agencies of the world trying to help, but the Israelis obviously having hit the World Central Kitchen, aid workers, and how do you analyze the humanitarian situation right now in Gaza, David?
Look, it's dire. There are no two ways about it. It's dire. And it is sickening to watch. And it is a genuine catastrophe. The question is, what is to be done about it? You know, there are problems around UNRWA. The Israelis were not wrong. This is an agency of Gazans. The UN is mandated wherever it goes to work with, one, the local authorities who are in Gaza, Hamas, and two, the local population. And if you have 11 to 12,000 Gazans, some of them will be Hamas. And those that aren't will have family and friends in Hamas. But at the same time, I think that everything now needs to be done to get aid in. I wouldn't have stopped funding to UNRWA right now. I would have looked at it after. But there comes a point, and I have sympathy with the Israelis when they say that Hamas are stealing aid, when they're not letting aid get in, when it's trying to send aid. But it comes to a point where it doesn't matter anymore. Israel now controls Gaza. It is incumbent on it to get that aid in and stop the famine to the degree that it can. It really is that simple.
Yeah, I would say the Israelis can't have it both ways. They can't say, oh, we want to have indefinite control of Gaza for security purposes, but then divorce themselves of the need to solve a range of humanitarian and governance problems. I would think that they should understand that Gaza needs to have some kind of Arab protectorate or de facto local governance, and then empower groups who can provide the humanitarian aid and promise a better future for Gazans. But while they're not doing that, they have to then deliver some kind of humanitarian outcomes, or there's no legitimacy to their continued occupation.
Yeah,
so
I agree.
It's very dire. The attack on the World Central Kitchen aid workers, where I believe 3 British nationals were killed, is something that is kind of going to be lost now because of this Iran attack. But it is a very, very low moment, and it's a blight. I just really hope and pray, David, that this is an opportunity to reset and that cooler heads might prevail. I think that you have to be hopeful in this Middle East region, but you can't be overly hopeful because all of the past history has told us that key moments will be missed rather than seized.
Agreed. I'm generally pretty negative about the Middle East, but one thing I will say when we talk about a reset, and I have no idea, Jason, when it will come, but often when things are kind of really bad, you can continue. But when they become catastrophic, as this has been catastrophic, that is an opportunity to reset. People can live with misery. This kind of complete catastrophe, something needs to be done because literally Gaza will need to be rebuilt. Literally.
I was listening to Ones and Twos, which is the economics podcast of Foreign Policy magazine. And Adam Tooze said, what's been happening in Gaza is not genocide, it's domicide. And that really resonated with me. Yes, it isn't genocide because if the Israelis simply wanted to kill all Gazans, they could kill them all. But what they are doing is they're destroying all of their homes. And something like 60 to 70% of the structures in Gaza have been fully or partially destroyed. So that means the majority of the Gazan population have experienced domicide. it can't be by mistake. It's not excusable. And then the question is, what is the international community going to do about it? So I would like us to pivot right now, David. Please, after the break, let's order the disorder together. So, David, Gazans are suffering from domicide. What can be done?
What can be done? Well, they just have to build them again. There's no other solution. You have to rebuild them. As you said earlier, Israel can't have it both ways. Especially on this, it destroyed all the homes. It either has to rebuild them or be instrumental in the processes of rebuilding them. It's that simple. This is something in all this that's really clear. If all the homes are destroyed and they've got nowhere to live, you've got to rebuild them. There's actually good precedent here. Not for this level of destruction, but one thing about Gaza we've both seen is it gets rebuilt a lot. You said, look, this is not genocide because if they wanted to do it, they could do it. It's not ethnic cleansing either. All these people say, oh, they're going to push all the Gazans out and take over. It's not going to happen. The Gazans will remain in Gaza, which means it's incumbent on Israel to rebuild the places where they live. It's that simple.
So let's talk about the role of Britain. I think that Britain can be an ordering and mediating power. Obviously, Britain seems to have been reasonably helpful or maybe even instrumental in the defensive airstrikes against the Iranian missiles. And Sunak has also said that, Israel shouldn't retaliate. What is a unique role that Britain can play here rather than being just the junior stepsister to the Americans?
Well, Britain has a fairly unique role in all of this because of how instrumental it was with the Balfour Declaration, with the partition of Palestine. And this was told to me actually by a senior Fatah member when I was in the West Bank late last year. So I think there is historical legacy, not always favorable, that binds Britain to this conflict and gives it a responsibility to this conflict. And I think its responsibility now is the same as the United States, the EU, and other major powers. It needs to urge restraint on Israel. Let's be clear, Israel has a legal right to respond to strikes on its sovereign territory. But as we've discussed, there's no point repeating. It is better for them and everyone else if they don't. And I think that's where Britain can add most value. It did, as you say, use a bit of hard power to be instrumental in the defensive strikes. But now I think it's time for its soft power, which it does very well.
That's right, David. Britain has a historic responsibility to both sides because of the promises made during and after World War I and because of the failures that happened during the Mandate period. But today, I see Britain as a soft power player. Britain hosts diaspora communities from pretty much every country in the region. It hosts Anglo-Yemenis. It hosts lots of Gulfi royals. It has displaced persons from every conflict in the region. There is a British-Israeli community on top of a very long and well centuries established British-Jewish community. And I feel like the UK has carved out a role potentially as a little bit more neutral than the US. So I would love, and I know he's not going to do it because this isn't Sunak's personality, but I would love if the British said, you know what, this is a big fucking deal. We actually have an embassy in Iran, unlike the Americans. We want to host a conference, or we're going to do shuttle diplomacy between Iran, Israel, Iranian proxies, Hamas, the Qataris. They're not going to do it, but they could. And they could do things that America can't do. And we should really keep this in mind for our listeners. Britain has an embassy in Tehran. And Britain has core equities with all of the Gulf states, and it can speak to different players than the Americans can. So, I mean, if Sunak wanted to really step up, I know that he's so concerned with the election campaign that will happen later this year, but if he wanted to step up and actually do something that would get his name in the history books, rather than the eat out to help out scheme, he would try to leverage Britain's real, unique geostrategic position. Right, David?
Yeah, I agree. Look, there are all sorts of things that Britain should do, especially around leveraging the BBC in these regions. I agree. Look, I don't think that the Israelis and Iranians would meet. I mean, the Iranians don't want it on with Israel. Don't forget that. And position to Israel is a fundamental ideological pillar of the Islamic Republic. It needs it internally. But your general point, I 100% agree with.
Well, so that's another historic moment, David. We both agree Britain should leverage its unique position and greater neutrality to try to de-escalate tensions in the region. It does seem like Sunak and Biden, Lord Cameron and Secretary Blinken are putting the screws on Netanyahu and the Israeli war cabinet to not retaliate. Will they be successful? We don't know. But what are other things Britain can do? Maybe it can propose solutions of how to deal with Iran's proxies, like the Houthis in Yemen that we've dealt with on previous shows, Hezbollah in Lebanon, Kataib Hezbollah, and other Shia militias in Iraq. I feel like Britain could try to use its good offices to propose regional solutions, getting the orderers on the same page. And this is, after all, the disorder program. So I'd like to close with a little soliloquy, Pretend this is the Bill Maher show, everyone. Instead of done the ordering the disorder, I've done my new rules segment. And everyone is laughing and you're all in a great mood. And now I pivot to you and I want to share something from my heart. And what I want to share from my heart is that what we witnessed on those early morning hours of April 14th in the skies of the Middle East, and this wasn't just the skies of Israel because it was in Saudi and Iraqi airspace as well, was a new kind of Middle East, the Middle East that I would rather exist and live in, where Saudi and Jordanian Air Force pilots and intel officers come to the defense of a nation under attack, even if that nation might be Israel. And when the Iranians announced that they would be doing their attack, there was obviously excellent coordination so that the roles of the US, the UK, Saudi, Israel, Jordan were all disambiguated and they acted together in a coordinated manner. What if we could just do that for diplomacy? What if we could get the Saudi approach to trying to make peace negotiations in Yemen coordinated with the US one so that Biden wouldn't all of a sudden call the Houthis a designated terrorist group, preventing the Saudis from paying Yemeni government salaries and undermining Western policy? Why can't we have other coordination, like working with the Lebanese government that is in, dire financial need, so that it can arrange more moderate positions? There's just a lot that we could do if we are all in it together, And it's always darkest before the dawn, and I see a real opportunity here if ordering leaders wanted to seize it. Netanyahu is not one such ordering leader, and obviously the Iranian proxy militias are not orderers. We're not going to see Houthi militias or Nasrallah, the leader of Hezbollah, choose to do some ordering. But that doesn't mean that because we have some difficult counterparties, we who want to order shouldn't order. So if Netanyahu won't play ball, there's every reason that Sunak and Biden and the King of Jordan should get Benny Gantz and Yair Lapid on the phone, because there's an alternative leadership in Israel waiting to come into being. And we can support it if we orderers, including critically the Sunni Gulfi Arab nations and Egypt and certain political factions in Lebanon, we can just do amongst ourselves the maximum amount of ordering that is possible, maybe have a meeting in Doha, and then present Israel and Iran with some kind of solution. Hey, buddies, if you don't do this, the aid is going to be cut off. Or to the Iranians, if you violate these agreements, it's not just going to be the sanctions. There's going to be these and these consequences. And use the unbelievable financial might that the orderers have to leverage the disorderers into a weaker position, and not only a weaker position financially, but with their own populaces who I believe don't want war. So that's how I'm going to end things. That's how I'd like to see the disorder ordered. Yes, 6 or 7 months have been wasted. Yes, we should have had a conference in Doha on October 9th proposing post-war governance solutions for Gaza that would prevent famine, that would prevent all these domicide airstrikes. But we can only do from where we are now. So now is the moment to use this next round to reset everyone's thinking. It's a new Middle East. It can be a Middle East where orderers rule the roost. Okay, thank you for listening, mega orderers. Love doing these off-the-cuff bonus episodes. So if you don't want to miss one, please hit follow. Furthermore, you can join our Substack by following the link in the show notes, where we share extra content and articles and background reading and more of my thoughts and on rare occasions, funny stories. And as always, I want to give the sincerest thanks to our producer, George McDonough, our executive producer at Goalhanger, Neil Fern. Alex is away on vacation in Italy. We miss you, Alex. And orderers, please email me and us at disordershow@gmail.com if you have any questions or you'd like to hear other topics covered. That's all for this week, and I will wish that your week is more orderly than the Middle East.